In Colorado today, the mystery of the little girl found strangled in the basement of her house. It's been more than a week since the murder of Jonbenet Ramsey, a 6-year-old beauty queen, shocked the town of Boulder. So far, there are no arrests, but many troubling questions.
From the family and scrutinizing a 3-page ransom note, which officials say was apparently planted as a decoy. Analysts say it is unlikely anyone could alter his or her handwriting for such a long document.
We're still hearing that Patsy wrote the ransom note. That's absurd. Every legitimate handwriting expert has said no.
The ransom note analysis, however, doesn't end with handwriting. The detectives enlisted the help of this man, Professor Donald Foster of Vassar College.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Put up your hand if you've ever heard of Professor Donald Foster. Keep your hand up if you know what Professor Foster was tasked to do in the Ramsey case. Keep your hand up if you know who hired Foster to consult on the Ramsey case. Keep your hand up if you know his job wasn't to analyze the handwriting of the ransom note, but to analyze the text for spelling, syntax, and semantics. Keep your hand up if you know the results of his 100-page report. Who did it suggest wrote the note? Keep your hand up if you know whether Professor Foster testified before the Boulder grand jury. Well, here's a spoiler. Professor Foster did something, and as a result, he wasn't allowed to testify. Is your hand still up? Now, I'm not sure if his notes were used as evidence, but in this analysis, we'll deal with his research and the twist that led to Boulder PD not allowing him to testify.
The private jet that took the parents of Jonbenet Ramsey to Georgia for her funeral landed in Colorado at dawn, much to the surprise of Boulder police, who apparently did not know the couple had left Atlanta.
But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, if you found the analysis on Mike Bynum interesting or compelling, we are going to be doing a part 2 to that at some point, so look out for that. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, if you're finding the Peripheral Figures series interesting, enjoyable, insightful, it does take a lot of effort to do this research. If you appreciate it, please do hit the thanks button. And based, really on your interest and your contributions, we'll decide how much longer we'll keep doing this, because we really do rely on your support. And let's get started.
Handwriting experts have ruled out John Ramsey and others close to the family. They have not excluded Patsy Ramsey, who has submitted several samples. The ransom note analysis, however, doesn't end with handwriting.
So to those folks who had their hands up for quite a while at the beginning of this video, did you know who hired Foster to consult on the case? Well, it appears to be the FBI who invited him. The FBI who, of course, never turned up. Yes, them. Have a look at this article from September 7, 1998 from Forbes magazine. When Donald Foster analyzes fingerprints in a criminal investigation, he doesn't head to the lab, he goes to the library. That is because Foster searches not for fingerprints, but for the patterns people leave in their writing. As the FBI's only forensic linguist, it is Foster's job to link authors and text. And I must say, I feel quite a lot like this particular individual, just in terms of my work, where I look for relationships and patterns within texts, within interviews, within information that is out there. I do a lot of reading. I tend to focus on patterns that are in terms of writing. And so I also head to the library. I also do a lot of reading. Anyway, back to Foster. Foster, an English professor at Vassar College, honed his talent for identifying unknown authors by analyzing Shakespearean-era poems in search of the bard's unattributed works. In February 1996, Foster pegged Joe Klein as the anonymous author of Primary Colors, his first sleuthing assignment outside of academia. Before long, he was analyzing notes in the Unabomber and the Jonbenet Ramsey murder cases at the request, there you have it, at the request of the FBI. Interestingly, the DA, Alex Hunter, also, as I understand it, greenlit Foster's participation.
When you are disguising your writing, you must concentrate on the writing itself. And any time that you relax that concentration, you will automatically go back to your habitual way of writing.
So in order to successfully disguise your handwriting, you need to move significantly away from your own default setting, your own baseline. But there's also another way to disguise your handwriting that's easier to maintain. If you're ambidextrous, for example. By the way, the dude talking about disguising handwriting isn't Professor Foster. And interestingly, Professor Foster's job had nothing to do with handwriting. It had to do with linguistics.
The detectives enlisted the help of this man, Professor Donald Foster of Vassar College. You look at something and you figure out who wrote it, in essence.
Yes, that's what I do best.
Foster analyzes not the handwriting, but the text, the content, and syntax.
So based on the lexicon, based on the syntax, based on the borrowing, based on the sentence structure, based on the associations, what could Foster discern about the author of the ransom note? And you can't help thinking that this had to have been a dream assignment for this particular individual.
Use of language, grammar, source material, borrowings, political or religious opinions, and anything that might enter into making a piece of writing distinctively one person's or another's, from punctuation to spelling and so on.
This really had to have been a sort of once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a 3-page ransom note in a really high-profile case. And it was something that Foster could really dig into. Just think how verbose this ransom note is, but how meaty it was from that perspective. And so could Foster use his skills in this pretty rare area, this pretty unique area, to find the true author of the ransom note, not some purported foreign faction? Could he do it?
Content and syntax.
Use of language, grammar, source material, borrowings, political or religious opinions, and anything that might enter into making a piece of writing distinctively one person's or another's, from punctuation to spelling and so on.
And think about the vast dimensions of the ransom note, the variations in spelling from possession and business to attaché. And then also those strange references to John, use that good southern common sense of yours. But then this is where the narrative gets weird. How Professor Foster actually became involved in the Ramsey case was, well, he felt sorry for Patsy. He saw Patsy's emotional distress and he reached out to her. He reached out to her first. He offered his services to the Ramseys.
Early in the case, Foster actually volunteered his expertise to Patsy Ramsey after reading of her extreme distress. Ironically, she never called, but the Boulder District Attorney's Office did.
Well, proving Foster was no slouch, he would go on to praise, I think in general, the work of the Boulder PD, and it's a position I happen to agree with. Sure, there were flaws and mistakes, but overall, Boulder PD did do good investigative work in an environment that was, well, it seemed designed to undermine them.
City officials insist Jonbenet's parents are still cooperating fully, but to many it appears they are traveling whenever and wherever they want to without telling police and answering questions only when it suits them. The parents have hired a private investigator, a media consultant, separate attorneys.
Oops, that's the wrong clip, but I think that was still worth playing anyway. Let's go to the right one.
In the Ramsey case, Foster had high marks for the detectives who brought him an impressive sampling of Patsy Ramsey's writings, letters, notes, even files police retrieved from the family computer.
Wait, what? Even files from the family computer? Did we get that right?
Even files police retrieved from the family computer.
My experience with the Boulder detectives was that they were entirely professional in their work, that they were dedicated to the case.
And the next thing that happens in this interview is Foster is asked point blank on camera who wrote the ransom note. And guess what happens when he's asked that?
Have you determined who wrote the ransom note?
I have no comment.
Foster is bound by a confidentiality agreement with the Boulder Police Department, but sources tell us in his report, summarized by detectives in the June presentation of evidence, Foster identified the writer of the ransom note as Patsy Ramsey.
Wow. Now, because this next audio is so important, I think we need to play that again and put the transcript on screen at the same time.
Have you determined who wrote the ransom note?
I have no comment.
Foster is bound by a confidentiality agreement with the Boulder Police Department, but sources tell us in his report, summarized by detectives in the June presentation of evidence, Foster identified the writer of the ransom note as Patsy Ramsey.
Now, I know many of you are registering the important piece of information there that he identifies Patsy Ramsey as the author, but the important piece of information is the date when that happens, during the June 1998 presentation. And we're going to deal with why that date is so important, why it's so legally sensitive in a second. Now, as we deal with the next section of the transcript, you might want to pause the video and read the transcript slowly and perhaps read it several times, because it cuts to a critical question. How did an expert apparently unambiguously determine the author of the ransom note?
How do we do it?
You can't.
And here it is.
Foster analyzed commonly used words and also found similarities between Patsy's letter format and that of the ransom note writers. The indentations and punctuation, especially the repeated use of the exclamation point.
Did you catch that? The reference to fat cat, and use that good southern common sense of yours. And you've got to try and think whether this actually matches Patsy's personality or not. And then just this idea of exclamation marks. Does this idea of a lot of exclamation marks match this idea of a very expressive, kind of intense personality? Yeah, basically a very expressive personality. And I have to say, in terms of the exclamation marks, when I did my own independent research, when I wrote the many books that I wrote on this case, that was an area I definitely went into. I tried to find pieces of Patsy's handwriting independently. Her newsletters, the notes on the back of cards, little messages here and there. What did one find? Well, the same pattern of using exclamation marks.
We looked back through our own archives and found two samples of Patsy's writing. This 1996 Christmas letter peppered with exclamation points, and this 1978 photo with a two-line note, each sentence ending in an exclamation point.
Pretty amazing, isn't it? And what would you say in general? Do you think men tend to write using exclamation marks, or do women tend to do that more? Just in general.
Also, sources say as many as 250 books were cataloged and photographed from various rooms in the Ramsey house. In the event, they yielded possible clues. At least one book found in the bedroom did. Mindhunter by FBI profiler John Douglas.
And one has to wonder, what did Foster think about that? Now, if Patsy wrote the note, and I say if because it was never determined in open court that she did, maybe the grand jury believed she did, but in any event, if she did write the note, I think that gave her away, if something gave her away, were all the books in the Ramsey home that fed into a very active imagination. Also, the movies also fed into that very active imagination. I think those newsletters were also instrumental, but there's another thing as well. Jonbenet's pageants were also very creative, very expressive enterprises. Think about what goes into them. Song, dance, dresses, creating certain looks, creating certain personas, creating certain roles, and creating certain performances to suit varying judges and varying settings. And think about this ransom note as doing something similar, a pageant in order to perform a certain role, to present a certain kind of performance to an audience, which in this case would be investigators. And if you take it further than that, the ransom note does seem to be filled with a similar floweriness, similar pageantry, for the lack of a better word, to this personality that we see with Patsy. Patsy who is flowery, Patsy who is interested in pageantry. But if it was clear from linguistics that Patsy wrote the note, why was it so unclear from handwriting analysis? Well, we now know Patsy was ambidextrous, which could offer an explanation in that regard. But besides that, it shows whoever wrote the note, whether it was Patsy or someone else, was devilishly clever at fooling almost everyone. And we do see some of that cleverness, that slyness, in the prime of Miss Jean Brodie, where you literally had, I think, 2 girls writing a note impersonating their teacher. And I think as a result of that, they weren't able to figure out who wrote the note. And if you think about it, it's this idea of writing with 2 hands. And isn't that the psychology that went into this ransom note? If someone was devilishly clever at fooling almost everyone, well, the note was also naively stupid, because some slightly smarter people, like FBI agent Ron Walker, weren't fooled really for a second. Ron Walker immediately saw through it, immediately saw that it was bogus, and he wasn't the only one. Even so, didn't the ransom note, whoever wrote it, and whatever it was supposed to do, didn't it ultimately succeed in distracting, misleading, misdirecting, and frustrating the efforts to prosecute this case? Because if you made the ransom note the vital piece of evidence, and you argued that whoever wrote it killed Jonbenet, as Steve Thomas believed, well, that wasn't going to get you anywhere either. But that brings us back to the central question. If Foster's evidence was so clear, so certain, so compelling, was it used in the Boulder grand jury? And the answer is no. Now, this aspect of the narrative is also something that Lawrence Schiller highlighted in his book, Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. I mean that the Vassar College professor's appraisal of the ransom note as a whole, but more pertinently, who wrote it, and more specifically, why this bombshell evidence never saw the light of day. Well, what is the story behind that? Well, interestingly, there are really 2 narratives for why this didn't happen. And I'm not sure if you guys appreciate just how important, how instrumental this particular individual's contribution to the case was, because in large measure, the Boulder PD built their case on his research. And so what ultimately happened to this expert? Well, there are 2 reasons why he didn't testify before the grand jury. The one is that Foster actually wrote Patsy a letter. Do you remember we said that June 1998 is an important date? Well, it's important to know that date because he actually wrote Patsy a letter. It was dated June 1997, 18 June 1997. It was written a year prior to the police presentation, which was in early June 1998. And in that letter, and we will deal with that letter, but we can highlight right now that in the letter he writes that he believes that Patsy is innocent. And this means that Boulder PD just simply can't use Foster as an impartial witness. Why? Because it shows he's kind of flip-flopping. 1 minute he's saying Patsy's innocent, and the next he's saying, well, she wrote this note. That seems like a real shame, doesn't it? You know, in a case where it's so hard to find quite strong evidence, quite a strong witness. Well, yeah, you found one, but you just can't actually use this expert. It seems like a shame, except when one examines the other narrative. Even if Foster hadn't blown his chance to discuss his report, even if this expert somehow was poised to testify, there were other legal reasons to oppose his testimony, and you're not going to believe what they are. But we'll deal with that in the next episode, part 2, to our analysis of this peripheral figure. And in that analysis, in part 2, we'll also dig into the letter, a 3-page letter, ironically, that he wrote to Patsy Ramsey, and look at what he said in that letter. Well, I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.